What about the distinction between movement? In the blue zones, it's not about, vigorous exercise and the way we think about it, treadmills and gyms and CrossFit and all that kind of stuff. It's just movement, is integrated into the daily lives in an almost unnoticeable way. And it's just continual and perpetual. But is there a distinction when you hone in on happiness between people that are, sort of active in the sense that they're walking and they're moving their bodies, or, maybe they work outdoors or what have you, versus, people that do kind of have a structured exercise regimen?
Well, people who are getting some sort of physical activity, 60 to 90 minutes a day, are happier, or more likely to be happy than people who are slothful. But I'm not aware of any research that breaks down intense physical activity and increased happiness or decreased happiness.
And you touched on volunteerism, but I would imagine, happiness is very much tied to service, right? So people whose lives are focused on giving back, in my experience, seem to be, happier people. And I know that I'm happier and more fulfilled and feeling more purposeful when I'm in the spirit of giving, even if that giving is really in the context of my professional life. That kind of, ethos, for me translates into a higher happiness quotient. So are there studies on that, or how does that break down?
The best thing I've ever heard along those lines comes from a Norwegian Buddhist monk who lives in Minnesota, who points out that we all have 99 problems. We're getting a wrinkle, we have an ache, our roof is leaking, we have a dent in our car, whatever it is. And we can put all of our effort into fixing those top problems and maybe resolve the top 10 of them. But by the time we get those top 10 off the list, there's 10 new ones at the bottom. So it's accepting that we're always going to have 99 problems and putting our focus elsewhere, usually on somebody else's problems or helping somebody else off. And in so doing that, those 99 problems diminish in size and they become less urgent and they become less salient in our everyday life. So yes, volunteering, helping others is a surefire way of making yourself happier.
Yeah, that's
water quality. There's a huge correlation between water quality, noise, as we talked about before, walkability, bikeability, programs that help the depressed and people who are anxious. There are city programs that could do that. So just making it clear of what cities can do that will really favor happiness. So we'll just incorporate it into our current blue zones.
They tend to express gratitude before each meal, so they'll actually pause and put some punctuation before their hurry worry of their life and before they eat. Makes it more likely that full feeling will travel from their belly to their brain and tell them to stop eating. And they tend to eat a huge breakfast. Breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And finally, the foundation on which all of this rests, they invest in their families. They tend to put their families first. They keep their aging parents nearby, invest in their kids, and make their spouse a priority as opposed to making work or friends or some sports team. They tend to belong to a faith-based community. I interviewed about 350 centenarians. All but 5 belong to some faith. It didn't seem to matter what faith they belonged to. But if you belong to a faith and show up at least 4 times a month, it adds between 4 and 14 years to your life expectancy. And we don't know if that's because you're less likely to engage in risky behaviors, or if because you have a better social network, or if because you have ritualized stress reduction, or if because there's a God and God said. But it seems to work. There's just a piece in the New York Times about 2 weeks ago kind of confirming this. And then finally, who you hang out with. In these blue zones, people were either born into or intentionally surrounded themselves with the right people who reinforce the right behaviors. We now know that if your 3 best friends are unhealthy and obese, there's about a 150% better chance that you'll be overweight yourself. Drinking too much, drugs, unhappiness, and even loneliness is contagious. And in these blue zones, the people they surround themselves with tend to eat a plant-based diet, They tend to care about each other. They keep an eye on each other, and it's one of these unconscious influences that exert an entire lifetime. So you add these all up, and it explains about 12 extra years of life expectancy. The maximum average life expectancy of the human population living in the first world right now is about 90. Anybody who tells you they can help you live to 100 probably has their hand in your pocket trying to sell you something. But for an average population living in the United States, you can say, you know what, if you optimize your lifestyle, you should get about 90 years. But in America, we're only getting 79. And people who follow this pyramid here are getting closest to that 90 years of anybody else in the world. So the 80-20 comes from the Danish twin study, which followed both fraternal twins and identical twins. The identical twins have the identical genes, and they then measure the disparity of when they die, and they've done it over 100 years. On average, people who make it to 100 sleep about 8 hours a night, on average. And certainly in these blue zones, they tend to go to bed soon after the sun sets, traditionally speaking, and the centenarians tend to continue to have the traditional patterns. And they'll often wake up in the middle of the night, or not quite in the middle, more towards the morning, and they'll wake up for a while, and then they'll go back to sleep. They'll have a second sleep, and then they're usually up around sunrise, and then it's a nap. In Ikaria, interestingly, this place with the really low rates of dementia, most of the year they're staying up to 1 or 2 in the morning, because those are the cool hours of the day, and then they'll sleep really late. They'll open their shops at 10 or 11. They'll go back and take a nap at 4, and then they'll be up really late. So there's some idiosyncrasy, but 8 hours is sort of an average, and a 20 to 30-minute nap in the middle of the afternoon, I would say, generally speaking. I mean, none of these, except the Loma Linda, California, which has a state-of-the-art hospital, none of these places are places you're going to want to go for a state-of-the-art organ transplant. But they do tend to have better public health, especially Costa Rica. I mentioned that Nicoya has about half the rate of middle-age mortality as we do in the United States. Everybody in that country has access to a health coach. Every single year, somebody's going to come knock on your door. They're going to ask, is anybody pregnant here? They're going to look around to see if there are people who might be at risk of diabetes or starting to suffer from obesity or maybe suffering from dementia. Right away do a spot check or a spot test and be able to get people in for help before it's a 911 emergency, like in this country where you have to give them expensive treatment. If you ask these old guys, these 100-year-olds that sit around the square, how they explain longevity, they almost always say clean air, clean water, and good food. So I often find there's an element of truth in these sort of time-honored adages you hear over and over again, but our study did not check water quality. The only place we looked into water was in the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica. And so you have Costa Rica, it does pretty well when it comes to longevity, but Nicoya is a big outlier. They live significantly longer. So we're looking, well, what's different about Nicoya that isn't like the rest of the main part of Costa Rica? And it turns out that most of Costa Rica is volcanic, but Nicoya is like the Caribbean. It's limestone. And the water that percolates through, that the people drink there, has very high levels of calcium and magnesium. And they get lots of sunshine. So it's just drinking this water throughout their life. It probably amounts to, taking this supplement. We know if you take, I'll ask you, Zeke, sunshine and calcium, what does that equal over a lifetime?
Better bones. It's actually, it's vitamin D, right?
Which comes from good sunshine. So we don't know this for sure, but it was an interesting connection. Magnesium. All of the populations except Sardinian are heterogeneous populations. In other words, they're melting pots. Okinawa, for example, been intermarrying with the rest of Southeast Asia for the last 400 years. And Adventists are black and Hispanic and Asian. And Sardinia is the only one that has perhaps a unique set of genes. When it comes to thinking about genes, most of us lie on a spectrum. There'll be a tiny percentage of us who could do everything right. Eat bean sprouts and tofu and run every day and have great social life and drop dead at 40 because of some bizarre cancer. And then there are people at the other end of the spectrum who can drink a fifth of whiskey and smoke and they live to 100 and they give longevity a bad name. But most of us are 1 or 2 standard deviations from the mean, meaning that we have the potential to make it to 80 or 90 by optimizing our lifestyle and environment. And that's what I try to do is articulate the ideal lifestyle environment for us to emulate. Gym is good for some people, but I think it's folly to think that we can sit in our office chairs for 8 hours a day and then go to the gym for a half hour and get enough physical activity. We evolutionarily evolved to be moving all the time. That's and like I said, in blue zones, they're moving every 20 minutes or so. I'm going to take a slight deviation here and answer your question in a longer way. So about 9 years ago, we started thinking about, could you make a blue zone in America? Could you actually make an American population live longer? And I got a huge grant from AARP and help from National Geographic. And we auditioned 5 cities to see if we could actually take an American population and help them live longer. We gave them all a test. We used Gallup's tool that measured life expectancy. And then we went about trying to change the environment so people would mindlessly, invisibly live longer. So instead of trying to change people's behavior, which is almost always a failure, change their environment. So I hired a bunch of smart people, Stanford and Harvard, University of Minnesota, and they pointed out that most of us live most of our lives within about 5 miles of our home. We call that a life radius, and we went about optimizing that. No technology, Zeke, here. And we got some data from the CDC who told us that if you want to optimize people's environment to live longer, the most cost-effective tool is changing policy. So it essentially boils down to this. Do you live in an environment where fruits and vegetables are cheapest and most accessible, or do you live in a place where every time you go anywhere you're going through a gauntlet of sugar-sweetened beverages, sodas, or junk food, or fast food restaurants? If you live in a neighborhood of 5 mile radius, or half a mile radius where there are more than 6 fast food restaurants, you're 30% more likely to be obese than if you live in a place where there are fewer than 3. Built environment. If you live in a place where parks are cleaned up, where streets are designed not just for cars but also for humans, you have bike lanes, you make it walkable, you can raise the physical activity level of the entire city by 30%. You don't have to give people gym memberships or get them to take yoga or give them a free t-shirt for joining the yoga class. We know that in any community about 60% of people are ready to change their health behaviors but don't have the tools. And by just putting them together and creating social networks, helping them find those 3 good friends that they can count on a bad day, that's a long-term intervention. The fourth part about it turns out that there's enormous possibility in changing the policies and the designs of buildings. Restaurants, grocery stores, schools, workplaces. You can design those so they're about 20 to 30% healthier by changing the defaults. And again, you put them in place once and you can just forget about them. And then helping people find their sense of purpose and a place to put that to work. And in our first city, Albert Lea, Minnesota, by taking this approach, we were actually able to raise life expectancy after 2 years by about 3.2 years, lower healthcare costs, and that model has now been scaled to 26 cities around the country, and it seems to be working very well.